So good evening, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on getting started with BREEDPLAN. I'd particularly like to thank Katrina and Brad for joining us from Australia. Katrina was in the office for 6:30 this morning, and it's not much later now, so it's an early start. So we're getting to the end of our day and they're just starting. So they're quite happy to talk for as long as they want. So as I mentioned, we've got two members of the ABRE team joining us to talk about BREEDPLAN. Katrina is going to do the presentation to start with. Katrina's a technical officer with ABRE, ABRE's extension services, and provides beef breeders with extension service and technical support to maximise the understanding of genetic technologies, including BREEDPLAN. So thank you, Katrina. And then assisting her with particularly the discussion and the questions afterwards will be Brad Cook. Some of us on the call have had the pleasure of discussing items with Brad previously. Brad manages the genetic research and development team at ABRE. He oversees testing and implementation of analytical processes used in a BREEDPLAN genetic evaluation and undertakes research relevant to this outcome. You can tell I read that, can't you? He also supplies technical support to ABRE's beef clients, including ourselves, and especially on the use of genomic data in genetic evaluations. So you won't really want to be listening to me for too long. So I'm going to introduce Katrina to do the presentation. She'll share the screen. She's got quite a few slides to go through. What I'm asked is if we let her go through the presentation in full and you save your questions till the end. I think if we start asking questions part through, we might start to digress a little bit. So bear with me. If you've got any questions when we get to the end, please just raise your hand via the reaction button on the bottom of the screen, and it says raise hand. Do that and I'll try and come to you in turn to ask your question, and then we'll move on from there. So with no further ado, Katrina, I'll leave it to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Clive. Good evening, everyone. So as Clive said, I'm going to talk about performance recording for BREEDPLAN and getting started with BREEDPLAN. So I'm going to briefly go through why performance record, then talk about how we can record BREEDPLAN traits, and then lastly end with some tips for effective performance recording. And then that will be followed by a Q&A session with myself and Brad. So I guess if we think about why should we performance record, we've got cattle grazing, growing, producing for you guys. But really the reason we want to performance record is because you can't manage what you don't measure. So you don't know how those cattle are performing if you've got no way of measuring them, no way of benchmarking them. You don't know if you're improving or going backwards. So really performance recording is all about managing the production system and managing the performance of those cattle for you. And so if we think about what drives profit and in your beef enterprises, really it's the number of calves that you have hit the ground, and then their weight, and then their quality, less the cost of production. So how much food are they consuming, whether or not that's on a pasture in the field or whether or not that's animals being finished in a feedlot system. So all of these traits are things that we can influence through genetics. So number of calves is going to come down to our fertility traits, weight is our growth traits, quality is our carcass traits, and then cost of production, how much feed those animals are consuming, are things like mature cow weight for the mature female herd, and also where they're available net feed intake. So all of these traits are things that are influenced by the genetics of the animal, and that if we measure, we can get a handle on them, and that allows us to measure them and improve them within the herd. So you may have seen something like this before. It says P equals G plus E. And what that really means is the way the animal looks and performs, or its phenotype, is influenced both by its genetics and also the environment that it's run in. So all of those traits that we were just talking about, there's a genetic component and there's an environmental component. And so the genetic component, the animal will get half of its genetics from dad and half from mum, and that's set at conception. So once the animal's conceived, its genetics are set. but the environment in which you run your animals will vary over the animal's life. They'll be exposed to different nutrition, different climate, different management. They'll have different health outcomes. Some of them will get sick, some of them won't. We've got different ages of animals. So what we're essentially trying to do is identify the genetics of that animal, which is what it's going to pass on to its progeny. But because we've got all of these environmental factors, it can be difficult to look at the animal and know its genetic potential, because we don't know whether or not the phenotype or the performance that we're seeing is caused by the genetics, by the environment, or by a combination of both. And so if we have a look at these two animals that I've pulled off the Beef Shorthorn website, we've got two animals here. I'd say from the look, one's obviously been prepped for show, one is more in a paddock condition. And if we just look at them and I ask you which animal has the better genetics for EMA, are we going to pick bull A or are we going to pick bull B? And it's a difficult decision because we don't know what the nutrition background of the animals has been, whether or not they're the same age. And so, for example, as well, whether or not one's out of a heifer calf or one's out of an older cow. And so it's very hard to look at these animals and say it's going to be bull A or it's going to be bull B. Now, in this particular case, it will be bull B. But equally, if I ask you for another trait, what about 400-day weight? Even though this is a growth trait and we can look at the animals, once again, we can't tell because they may have had different levels of nutrition or they might have been out of different aged dams, which one's going to have the better genetics. And in that case, bull A. And then last question, calving ease direct. They're actually the same, 2.3 for calving ease, but it's always difficult to do this with pictures. It's much easier when you've got animals in the yards in front of you, but it is very hard to just look at those animals and know just by looking at them which one's going to have the better genetic potential for a particular trait. And so that's why we use BREEDPLAN. BREEDPLAN is all about getting an understanding of the genetic merit of the individual animal, and we're separating the genotype or the genetics from the environmental impact. So our EBV is made up, we're just capturing the genetic potential of the animal, just that genetic influence that it's going to pass on to its progeny, and removing those environmental effects as noise. So if we think about recording BREEDPLAN traits now, Beef Shorthorn has 15 EBVs for economically important traits, and they range through traits that are important to the whole production system. So there's calving and fertility traits, growth traits, carcass traits, fertility traits. So lots of traits there that are important from different aspects of the production system. Now, I guess what's important to know is that most of those traits are not inherited in isolation. So that means that when we run the analysis, the performance of an animal for one trait can and will impact the EBVs of other related traits. So for example, 200, 400 and 600-day weights are correlated traits. They're all growth traits. And so if you put a 200-day weight into the system, that will give us information that we can use for 400 and 600-day weight as well, for example. So when you're recording, you're trying to capture a specific trait, but it's also going to inform other related traits for the animal. And when you are recording, there's obviously a lot of traits. They cover a spectrum of, as I said, fertility, calving, growth, carcass, and they're all economically important traits, but there's no requirement for you to record all of the performance information for all of the traits. But what I would suggest is that if you're looking at these traits, you think, well, which of these are important to me or to your bull buying clients? And they're the ones that I would recommend that you aim to record, because that way you're capturing information on all of those traits that are important to breeding objectives for you and your clients, and getting a handle on those important traits that are particularly important for your production system. So I wanted to put this performance recording timeline up because for me, I think it's a really useful thing to think about, well, how can we performance record in line with the animal at certain life stages, and these are life stages where you will be usually bringing the animals in and doing different husbandry practices with them anyway. So I think one thing when you think about recording is you want to try and fit it in with your normal schedule and your normal management of those animals, and then that way it just becomes part of something that happens. So when you're doing other husbandry things with those animals. So really, if we look at the performance recording timeline, we can break it down into joining, birth, weaning, yearling, 18 months, and then maturity. And so I'm going to go through these in more detail, but I just think this is a really nice way when you're first starting out and thinking about performance recording to think about how you can record those traits at certain life stages and fit it in with your everyday management. So at joining, this is when we can start to collect things like our mating program details, and we use those joining details for natural matings to calculate days to calving EBVs. You can also collect AI dates, and they are useful for calculating gestation length EBVs. So they would normally be supplied to your breed society when you're registering AI calves, and having that AI date along with the birth date allows us to calculate those gestation length EBVs. And then thirdly, you can look to collect your pregnancy test results. These are an optional thing. We're not currently using them in the calculation of days to calving EBVs, but they may be of use in the future. So this is a third thing if you're preg testing that can be collected at joining. When we get on to birth, the next things that we can start to collect are date of birth. Now that's important obviously for calf registration, but it's also important to the breed plan analysis in that it influences how the analysis forms contemporary groups, which is, I think Brad will talk about them hopefully in his webinar, but how we ensure that only animals that have had equal opportunity to perform are directly compared. That's within a contemporary group. And so date of birth is one of the factors that we use to decide whether or not animals can genuinely be compared head to head. So for example, we wouldn't compare a 2022 born calf with a 2023 born calf directly because they've been born in different years and they'll have different impacts that way. So date of birth, as I said on the previous slide, also important for calculating those gestation length EBVs. If you've got ET calves, this is where it's really important to make sure those recip dam information is captured, and that's also important for breed plan contemporary group formation, because if we think about different breeds and we think about using a beef recip versus a dairy cow recip, we know that there's going to be differences in the breeds of recips that are going to influence how the calf performs. So obviously if we're using a dairy based recip, we would expect she's going to produce a lot more milk and give a lot more to her calf than a beef breed necessarily would. And so we want to capture recip dam information so we have a handle for those ET calves on what the impact of the recip dam breed is likely to be. We can also take birth weights. These are particularly useful for calculating our birth weight EBVs and our calving ease EBVs. Now, there's a range of ways in which you can take birth weights. I'm just going to run through a few of them and just show you some options that different producers use. One of these is the sling and clock face scale. So you can see here that goes round the calf, lifts it up, and you read the weight at the top. We can also use platform scales, and these can be attached to the side of a ute or a quad bike to help you drive around the field. And I'm going to say paddock. I'm going to apologize for saying paddock. I'm going to try and remind myself to say field. Around the field and catch the calf and record them on the platform scales. We also have commercial calf cradles available. So these can also be put on quad bikes, capture the calf, put the calf in the cradle and record its weight. I don't know what the situation's like in the UK, but we've certainly seen some calf catchers with scales come into the Australian market in recent years. These are quite nice in that you can section the calf off into the calf catcher, and that gives you a little bit more protection from very protective mothers because the calf is contained within the calf catcher. Our Australian producers tell me they work quite well on flat surfaces. Our New Zealand-based producers tell me that they don't work very well on very steep country. So obviously going to depend on the sort of country that you're running animals on, whether or not calf catchers are an option. We also have plenty of producers that just use bathroom scales. So they take the bathroom scales out in the paddock, stand on it, get their weight, pick the calf up, get their weight plus the calf, and then deduct that to get the calf weight only. So a range of options. Different options are going to suit different people, but certainly it can be as low tech as having a pair of bathroom scales that you cart around the field with you. We're aware that overseas, some breed societies allow the use of weight tapes, so coronet band tapes, as a means of estimating birth weight. We would prefer, if this is going on, that we get the measurement of the coronet band rather than the estimated birth weight, so that we know it's a coronet band measurement. If I was giving this presentation in Australia, I would tell you that they're not sufficiently accurate. So a lot of our Australian-based breed societies have rules that they can't use weight tapes because, I'm going to get this the right way around, they tend to overestimate the weight of the lighter calves. So the lighter calves look heavier than they are, and they also tend to underestimate the weight of the heavier calves. So those heavier calves look lighter than they are. So we don't get as much variation using the tapes as we would if we were using the scales. And so that's why in Australia we don't use them. But as I said, we're aware that overseas, breed societies are allowing birth weight tapes, and so that is a valid option for those overseas societies that are allowing their members to do that. And then the fourth trait that we can record at birth is our calving difficulty scores. So we use these for calving ease EBV calculation, scale of 1 to 6, which you can see on the score here, ranging from 1 unassisted, where she calves without any difficulty, easy pull, hard pull, surgical assistance, a malpresentation 5, such as a breech, and then 6, elective surgery, where she's not in calf, she's not calving, but you take the calf out surgically before she's had the opportunity to calve. So 1 to 6 scale. If you're out in the field each day checking the pregnant cows and you have a cow that has calved between visits, then you're fine to assume that she was unassisted because she's calved, no trouble, and you've been checking them regularly. We would ask that you record calving difficulty for all calves, including the dead calves. Now, obviously, we're not interested in the EBVs of a dead calf in terms of its breeding potential, but that information is quite useful for its sire and its dam and its relatives. So, for example, if we see a particular sire line is having a lot of hard pulls, for example, that's going to influence the EBV of the sire, even though if those calves were deceased, we're not interested in their EBVs per se. And when you're submitting them, if you leave those fields blank, then that's usually interpreted as no score rather than no difficulty. So blanks aren't going to be scored. If they are unassisted, make sure you put a one in there. Okay, so moving on to weaning. The first thing we can take here is our 200-day weight. So particularly useful for our 200-day growth EBVs and our milk EBVs. The calves are generally need to be aged between 80 and 300 days, and we can record up to 2 200-day weights per calf. Now, I would recommend if you're doing that we look to have a minimum of 30 days between those two measurements. If you're taking two of them, there's not much point taking a weight today and then another weight in 2 or 3 days. The calves are unlikely to have grown much or re-ranked much. So if you are looking to take two, I'd take two at least a month apart. So bring them in twice separately with a good amount of time between them to take those two 200-day weights. This is also at weaning when we take the mature cow weights on those calves' dams, and we use that for our mature cow weight EBVs. Those mature cow weights need to be collected within 2 weeks of the cow's calf having a 200-day weight recorded, but our best practice would be to recommend that you weigh the cows on the same day that you collect 200-day weights on their calves. We can take up to 4 mature cow weights per cow, but we will only analyse it if the first valid mature cow weight is taken before she's 6 years old. In practice, because we don't want you guys standing out there trying to draft cows, trying to work out, has she had 3 mature cow weights analysed, 4 mature cow weights analysed, what I would recommend is just weigh all of them, run them all through the scales. BREEDPLAN will work out which we can and can't analyse. So rather than you wasting time in the yards, just run them all over the scales and let the analysis sort it out for you. We can also temperament score at weaning. Now, these temperament scores are used to calculate our docility EBV. This is not an EBV that Beef Shorthorn currently reports, but I've put it in here just in case it might be something you consider in the future as a breed society. Obviously, in order to introduce a new EBV, we need to have trait data recorded, and so there's always a bit of a chicken and an egg situation where if the trait is never recorded, you never get an EBV for it. So I've just put it on here just as this is when it's done, this is how you do it, but noting that currently Beef Shorthorn certainly doesn't report docility EBVs. So there's 2 methods of doing it, yard and crush. It's a scoring system of 1 to 5, and what you do if you're doing a yard method is individually pen a calf and hold it in the corner for 30 seconds and see how it reacts, or you can bring them in, hold them in the crush for 30 seconds and see how they react. When you're doing it, it's really important that the same person scores all calves. While we have a standardized 1 to 5 score, everyone's going to have a little bit of a different interpretation. So long as the one person has scored all of the calves, then we know that the scoring method for that particular cohort has been consistent. And I know this sounds really obvious, but I have had issues with this before in the past. If you are taking docility scores, please do that before you undertake other animal husbandry procedures. It is not a good idea to mark, vaccinate or steer them and then try and take a docility score, because we're not going to get how they would normally react. We're going to get a higher reaction generally. Okay, so moving on to yearling. This is when we can take our 400-day weights. Calves need to be aged between 301 and 500 days, and just as we can with 200-day weight, we can record up to 2 400-day weights per calf. And once again, I'd make sure if you're taking 2 weights that you just have a bit of time between them. The other thing we can take at yearling is scrotal circumference measurements. These are particularly useful for our scrotal size EBVs, and they're also correlated with our other fertility EBVs. Bulls need to be aged between 300 and 700 days of age when you take scrotals. The biggest tip, I guess, is what we're trying to do with scrotal circumference is get an idea of when the animal is going through puberty. So it's a puberty trait. Are they early puberty or late puberty bulls? And so what we want to do is collect scrotal circumference when they're going through puberty. That's generally around 400 days of age, because what we're really trying to pick up is, was that bull pubertal, through puberty, or not yet pubertal? So around that 400 days of age is ideal. We recommend you use a self-tensioning scrotal measurement tape. So the one pictured on the screen is a reliable tape. The reason that we recommend a self-tensioning tape is because then we can be sure that you're putting an equal amount of pressure on each bull when you're taking scrotal measurements. If you're using tapes that you pull tight, there's a potential that you're going to put different amounts of pressure on different bulls, which will impact the scrotal measurements. You don't need an accredited technician or a vet. You can take them yourselves. And just when you are taking them, make sure you watch where you put your thumb. We want to avoid separating the cords where we can. So it's important that you hold them with your thumb on the side rather than in the middle. Okay, so our next age group is between yearling and 18 months, and this is when we can start to get our ultrasound scanning done. So this is when we would collect ultrasound scanning on the live animal, which we can use to calculate our carcass CBVs. And this is how the majority of carcass information comes in for seed stock or stud animals. We certainly can take abattoir carcass data on cohorts, but generally at a seed stock level, we don't have too many animals going off to the abattoir, so we use live animal scanning instead. Ultrasound scanning is collected on animals when they're aged between 300 and 800 days of age. So it is a little bit more expensive to record because you have to have an accredited ultrasound scanner. And so I think it's important to note that we can only analyze one set of ultrasound scan data per animal. And that's important because you will be paying your scanner to come out and scan the animals, and therefore you don't want to be paying for two sets of ultrasound scanning throughout the animal's life where we're only going to use one. You must use a BREEDPLAN accredited scanner. So there's currently 9 based in the UK. There was a few additional scanners accredited just before Christmas. So I did put them up on the website and have a quick look at where they're based. And I think you've got a fairly nice spread throughout the UK of where they are located. So there should be a BREEDPLAN accredited scanner near you. If I was talking to an Australian audience where we're obviously a bit more geographically spread, I would recommend that you look at who is scanning around your area and try and work in with your neighbours. If you know that your neighbours scan, see who they use, see if they can, see if that scanner can do your animals at the same time. That does help to save on travel costs as well, where I'm assuming, like in Australia, that the scanners will charge a per head basis and a travel cost as well. But if that's not the case, then not so important. But certainly in Australia, we would be recommending to try and work in at a similar time of scanning as the neighbours to get the scanner there once rather than lots of times throughout the area. When you are looking at those animals and thinking about should I scan them, the most important thing is condition of the stock. So you want to have a minimum of 3 to 5 mil rib and rump fat depth, and also IMFs further optimized at 2 to 8% IMF. So I think really what we're looking for when you're scanning is they need to be in adequate condition, but they also need to have been on a rising plane of nutrition. So you want them to have been gradually gaining weight. You don't, for example, want them to have been pretty light for months and then bring them in, feed them up for a month and scan. That's not going to give you good variation. Make sure that they've been on that nice rising plane of nutrition and have adequate fat depth to really make the most out of that scan data. Also, we tend to see that people scan their bulls rather than their heifers because bulls are the ones that are being sold, and certainly over here people are looking for bulls to have been scanned so that there's scan data on the sale bull cohort. Heifers provide really valuable information for ultrasound scan data as well. That's twofold for that reason. Firstly, they tend to mature a little bit earlier than bulls, so they typically have more fat at the same age, which gives us more variation in the trait. But secondly, if you think about your sale bull team, often they are they're the pick of the bulls. They're not going to be Your cull bulls, they'll have been culled and you'll have just kept the best ones. Whereas with heifers, there's generally a little bit less selection pressure. And so heifers often represent a wider cohort of the herd than the sale bull team. And so that can be important for the breed plan analysis, because sometimes those less good animals provide really valuable information, because they give us better variation and a better understanding of which ones look good and which ones don't look so good. Okay, our last trait is at 18 months of age, 600-day weight. Obviously useful for 600-day weight EBVs. Animals need to be between 501 and 900 days, and we can record up to 2 600-day weights per calf. So sometimes we see people quite happy to do the bulls and aren't really sure how to handle those pregnant heifers. So you can collect 600-day weights from pregnant heifers. What I would recommend where you can is to take a 600-day weight on those heifers before they're more than 3 to 4 months pregnant, because at that sort of pregnancy stage, the fetus isn't particularly big. It's not going to have a big impact on the weight of the heifer. If they're more than 3 to 4 months pregnant, I would only record a 600-day weight if you are preg testing them, and you can put those that are preg tested in calf into a separate management group to those that are preg tested empty. Furthermore, we really should be looking at only having, if they're 4 or 5 months pregnant, only having those that are preg tested in calf at a similar state of pregnancy being put in the same management group. So we don't want to be putting heifers that are 5 months pregnant, 6 months pregnant, 7 months pregnant in the same group. So really, therefore, where you can, ideally try and do them before they're too pregnant, before they're 3 to 4 months. That's what I just said. Okay, so that kind of nicely brings us on to management groups. So that was a very quick overview of how to record the breed plan traits. But I mentioned before that contemporary groups are how we make sure that we're only comparing animals that have had equal opportunity to perform. And that's how we essentially get rid of environmental effects within the analysis. If they've been running in the same environment, exposed to the same environment, then the differences that we observe in animals are likely to be genetic based. And so that's why we have contemporary groups. But part of and there's a whole range of factors that we use to calculate contemporary groups, but one of those is breeder assigned management groups. And that's because we can't see what's going on in the field, and therefore we rely on you to act as eyes for the breed plan analysis by assigning management groups. So management groups are really your way of saying, yes, these animals should be compared, or no, these animals shouldn't be compared. They haven't been treated the same. So there's 2 types. The first is birth management groups. And what the birth management group is for the birth traits, so birth weight and calving ease. And it's really allowing you to tell us, was there differences in how you treated the cows in the lead up to their birth, or the birth of their calves, particularly in that last trimester, that may have influenced the birth weight or the calving ease when the calf was born. And so if you're running a mob of cows in the one field together, you're not usually going to need birth management groups. The sort of situation where we see people needing to apply birth management groups is where you might have the pregnant cow split into 2 mobs, and one mob's running in a field with really good feed and the other mob's running in a field with poor feed. That's where I'd be putting them into management group A and management group B. Sometimes we see situations where some of the cows are out on agistment, others are remaining at home. Equally, that's a situation where they're on different properties, they're having different feed levels before calving. That's a birth management group. The last spot where I'd put a birth management group is where you've got an individual calf that was premature, or the dam was sick prior to calving. So this birth management group is generally about the treatment of the cows in the lead up to calving. We also have post-birth management groups, and so this is all about telling BREEDPLAN where animals have received different treatment or management once they were born, and that's influenced their performance. So common examples, an animal was sick or injured and that's affected its growth, for example, you would put a management group in with its weight to tell us that no, it's sick or injured, don't compare it to the rest of the calves. If you've got different feeding regimes, so some animals are out in different fields with different nutritional qualities, or a subset of your calves are being supplementary fed. So say, for example, you have a show team that's being supplementary fed and calves that aren't in the show team that aren't being supplementary fed, two different management groups. I'm not sure how much yearling mating is going on in the UK, but if you are using some of your yearling bulls for mating and the others are just sitting around in the paddock doing nothing, then they would be different management groups as well, because some of them have been working and that's going to impact their growth, their performance, their weight. So really, management groups are all about telling us these animals have been treated differently. It's likely to have influence their performance. It's not valid to compare them head to head. Sometimes it's straightforward, but sometimes it can be a bit tricky, particularly in situations where you've got potties or twins or fosters or a whole range of different things. So my biggest advice about management groups is, if you're not sure whether or not you should assign management groups in a particular situation, please ask. It's better to talk through with someone, whether or not that's the office or they can pass it on to the BREEDPLAN team. It's better to talk through that situation, get a handle on what's going on, and make a informed decision rather than be unsure and not get it right. So always ask if you're not sure whether or not you should assign management groups. We're happy to help. So I'm aware that that's a pretty quick crash course in performance recording. So there are a range of tip sheets and associated videos available on the Help Centre of the BREEDPLAN website that cover recording, submitting data, recording management groups. I'd recommend, if you want to have a look at those, that you have a look, and that'll give you a lot more information than what I've been able to cover in this webinar. So our last section is effective performance recording, and I basically wanted to just give you a few tips on how you can make the most of your recording for BREEDPLAN. So I guess one of the main things to note is that smaller herds can still use BREEDPLAN effectively. We don't have a minimum herd size requirement. So what this is showing us here is contemporary group size along the x-axis and then the record effectiveness. And what you'll note, hopefully, is that if we have just one animal, we've got nothing to compare it to, so we can't use its record effectively. But even if we only have two animals, we can start to use that data effectively. So it's not as good as having 6 to 10 animals, and after that it starts to plateau off. But certainly if you've got 2 or 3 animals, we can make use of that data within the BREEDPLAN analysis and use it to calculate EBVs for those animals. So how can we try and maximize our contemporary group size and get the most out of our performance recording? One thing that I would recommend you look to do is to restrict your calving periods. So aim to have as short a calving period as you practically can. 6 to 8 weeks is really nice and ideal, but even if it's 10 to 12 weeks, that's still going to give us a nice short amount of time that those calves are hitting the ground, where we can maximize the age groupings there and get those animals into the same contemporary groups and analyze them together. We want to try and run all of your calves under the same management conditions for as long as possible. If you need to split your calves, then we would recommend that you use the automatic contemporary group formation. So for example, we're not going to compare heifer calves with bull calves because we have a sex effect. So therefore, if you do need to split the mobs, that's a nice way to do it, where you're not going to affect contemporary groups. We also don't compare singles with twins. So if you need to split that way, that's also a valid option. And we compare natural and AI calves together, but not with ETs. So that's another option, is splitting those ET calves out if you do need to split calves. If you are going to split the group, I would recommend that you take a measurement on them before you do. So for example, if you know that you're going to prep a show team, or you're looking to steer some animals, or you're going to cull some animals, that's a really nice time before you do that to take a weight. So for example, if you're prepping the show team and they're quite young, they're weaner calves, take a 200-day weight on them and then split them off into their feeding groups, so that at least the analysis will have one data set where all of the calves were ranked against each other, and that gives us a nice basis. Even if they're split for future measurements, we can come back and we know that how they performed relative to each other for their first weight. One of the things we use for contemporary group formation is the day of measurement. So therefore, it's important to measure all of those animals on the same day. And we want to do that whole management group, or that whole mob of calves, on that one day for the trait that you're recording. Where applicable, you can look to make use of associated herds and or commercial animals. So associated herds occur where we've got two herds running animals together on the same property, and we can associate those for breed plan purposes so that we can compare them head to head. The most usual situation where we see this happen is where mum and dad have the main stud herd, and then the kids might have their own stud with a couple of animals. If that's the situation that you've got, associate those two herds for breed plan purposes. That allows us to compare those animals head to head, and that can help boost the number of animals in the contemporary group. If the Breed Society allows, sometimes it's possible to record commercial animals for performance purposes. That's particularly nice if you've got commercial animals and stud animals running together on the same property, because if you record them all for performance purposes, that can boost the number of animals in the contemporary group. We want to also try and use more than one sire for our calves for that calving year cohort. That's because just like we need multiple animals within the contemporary group so we can compare calves against each other, we also want to have multiple sires represented in the contemporary group so that we can compare the progeny of one sire against the progeny of the other sire. If we don't have that situation, if you just have a single sire represented within the contemporary group, we can certainly use that information to calculate EBVs for the individual calves, but it's not going to go back against the sire's EBVs himself. So therefore, we want to try and have at least two sires represented in the herd with their calves being born at a similar time, and then manage those calves together until you've collected the key performance traits, so that we've got management groups for different traits where they've all been compared, well, where the two sires are represented. And lastly, we want to supply recipient dam details. So as I said earlier, if we think about a dairy cow and a beef cow, we know that those cows are going to contribute different amounts to their calf in terms of the recip dams. So generally what we'd be trying to do is use recip dams of the same breed, and that means that when the calves, those ET calves are born, if the recip dams are the same breed, we can compare those resulting calves head to head, because we can account for breed effect there, because they're all out of recip dams of the same breed. So I would avoid what we call the licorice all sorts of recip dams, where they're all just a mishmash of whichever cows you could find, and try and use preferably the same breed, and where possible, ex-stud cows are really nice to use as recips, because we have a little bit of information on those ex-stud cows as well within the system, which is helpful for the analysis. So as I said, smaller herds can use BREEDPLAN effectively. We do have a nice case study. It is an Australian case study. I don't have a UK one, unfortunately, but it's a nice case study in that Bill and Minnie have been using BREEDPLAN for 25 plus years. They've got around 30 breeders. That includes a handful of first calf heifers that they manage separately, and they find that they can form adequate size contemporary groups, they can record data, but it's just a little bit more work for them to make sure that they manage their herd effectively so that they do get good size contemporary groups. It's available on the website, and I think the slide set's going to come around. So if you scan the QR code, that will take you to a PDF version. And it's just Bill and Minnie answering a few questions about how they manage their herd to make the most out of BREEDPLAN. So as I said a little bit earlier, that's a bit of a crash course in performance recording. There's a lot of information there, a lot more information available. I would recommend, if you are looking to performance record, that you grab a copy of the recording performance information booklet that includes the timeline, how to record each trait, how to submit performance data, and a range of other performance recording considerations, including tips for smaller herds. Available via the BREEDPLAN website or by scanning the QR code, and all of the tip sheets that have an associated video. Within the booklet, there is a QR code that will take you to the video for that particular tip sheet. And that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. Brilliant. I'm conscious we got over 70 folks on the webinar, so I'm sure there's going to be a rush of questions. Some of you that are more familiar with it already will have put a few things in the chat. So for those of you that don't want to ask questions, you can click on the chat button at the bottom and type in your comment or question. We have had a few already, so I will just run through some of those and start that off as you're getting ready to ask your questions, etc., etc. There was one, and at first question actually initially was from Tina about ET calves and recording, and with recipients you touched on that at the end, and I had passed that query on previously to Abri, and Brad was going to pick that up with you, Tina, so I'll skip that one if you don't mind, and he'll pick it up with you a bit later on. There was a question around weight. So I think John Scott asked how many hours after birth in terms of taking weight. What's the recommendation for that?
Within 24 hours.
Okay, good. There was a question about malpresentation option for calving difficulty scores. Is that an option, a standard option with Abri, as it's not on offer on BREEDPLAN, on Farm Plan rather?
Okay, I'm not familiar with Farm Plan, but it should be a standard option for ABRI that, there's a 1 to 6 scale and malpresentation should be 5. I don't know if Brad's familiar with
let me come in there.
Plan.
I'm not familiar with Farm Plan, but what we see when we look internationally is that different breed societies record birth difficulty scores in slightly different ways. So while when Katrina is talking about the 1 to 6, that's our standardizing scale. So I'm aware that in the UK, some breed societies might have a 1 to 7 scale, for example, and we look to take that and standardize it to our 1 to 6 when we extract for the genetic evaluation. Now, malpresentation can be recorded on the database. How you get that data into the database depends on the system that you're using. So if Farm Plan is not allowing you to record malpresentation, excuse me, that's a limitation of Farm Plan, not of what the society database can accept and what BREEDPLAN can use for the analysis.
Okay, thank you, Brad. There was a question there about accredited scanners in Southern Ireland, but David has come in and suggested William Tate. So can I suggest that Shane that asked the question and David that answered it perhaps correspond between each other and help each other out on that one? there was a query about the accountability of EBVs. So Graham mentions that either ABRI and the society, etc., don't assume responsibility for EBVs. So who is accountable for estimated breeding values? That sounds like a question for you, Brad.
Yes, I was going to say I'll put my hand up for that one. That's actually, I think it's a good question to ask. I'm not sure where the conclusion that was put forward comes from. In terms of responsibilities, data is the responsibility of breeders. Storing the data is the responsibility of the breed registry or the society or the office, and the calculation of EBVs is the responsibility of ABRI BREEDPLAN. In terms of the EBVs themselves, they are only as good as the data that is available. So when we come to the monthly BREEDPLAN evaluation, we go into the society database, we run a data extract. We run data extract software that pulls out pedigree information, all the details we need on animals, and all the performance information that we are looking to include in the evaluation. We take no responsibility for the quality of that data. That lies with the breeders and the society. So the quality of the EBVs is always dependent on the quality of the data, but the calculation of the EBVs is the responsibility of ABRI, the team that I am representing here. If there are any concerns about EBVs, they can be communicated to, for example, to the Beef Shorthorn Society. That then comes through to me, and it's my responsibility to actually look at why EBVs are the way that they are. So my answer is there's responsibility across the entire pipeline. It's just we have different groups responsible for different parts of that.
Okay, thank you, Brad.
Can I give my take on that? Because I read that in a slightly different way, and I agree with what Brad said, but I guess often when I'm out and about talking to producers in the field, we get a similar question, which is how can we trust that the seed stock producer is doing the best job they can to performance record? And as Brad said, it's up to the seed stock producer to collect the data and to give good quality data into the analysis. But I guess in terms of how can we trust that people are doing the right thing, there are some checks and balances within the BREEDPLAN analysis. We expect data to look and present in certain ways. But I guess when you're looking to buy animals, and this is what I say to commercial producers a lot, is I think it's where relationships and building relationships between the seed stock and the commercial clients becomes really important, because if you can't trust that your seed stock producer is doing the best job to collect data, you also can't trust that they're doing the best job they can with pedigree, with crowding, with, are they vaccinating their cattle like they say they are, all those sorts of things. And so I think the concept of making sure you develop a good relationship with your commercial cattle buyers and that they develop a good relationship with you as a seed stock supplier is so important, because the industry is built on trust. Obviously, that doesn't mean that there won't be the odd person doing the wrong thing, but if you're in it for the long game and you're in it to be a seed stock producer for a long time, then it's not worth cheating the system.
Can I just add there, Clive? I think that's the beauty of having Katrina and I here together. I am a totally technical man, and all I'm interested in is how things fit together and numbers that crunch. Katrina's actually grounded in reality. She's out in the the fields and working with the breeders. So always tap into both of us.
She's the one in the real world. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I'm just in an ivory tower somewhere.
we've got another couple of questions in the chat, so I'll do these two, but then you need to start raising your hands if you've got any other comments, or add a few more in the chat. So one from Tim Riley: is there a provision to report natural servings so that they can add to GL calculations? I guess that's gestation length.
Yeah, so if it's an hand mating situation, yes. If it's just an observed in the field, no, because we don't know if that observed mating in the field is the one that's resulted in the pregnancy. So if you're in a situation where you are hand mating, yes, absolutely, that can be added and used for gestation length, but otherwise, no.
If I can add in on there, one of the difficulties with a topic like this is that we have you as breeders recording something like a hand mating, which BREEDPLAN can use. But the critical bit is, how is that information recorded on the database? And we've got another group who's involved there who aren't present at this meeting. And so whenever there are questions, and this taps into Tina's question about the recipients, where there's questions about how data is or isn't being knitted together, it's important to include me so that I can then speak to the Shah Relay office just to make sure that we've got processes working correctly there. So hand mating, yes, definitely can be recorded and can be used in gestation length calculations in the BREEDPLAN evaluation. But how you get that record into the system depends on some communication with the office there, because not every office staff member knows every aspect of every data requirement in the system.
Okay, thank you for that. Got a question from Stuart Curry, which actually ties in with something I was going to ask, so I'll merge the two together really. So we've talked before about percentage of accuracy or accuracy percentage. From my point of view, I'm keen that we improve that accuracy percentage. Stuart's asking, what's the minimum accuracy percentage you should accept when looking to buy a bull?
So I guess I don't use it as a minimum accuracy percentage that's acceptable. I talk more about risk and what the particular situation is. So if it's published, there's an associated accuracy with it, but we're happy that, you know, it's a usable EBV. In terms of younger animals, they're going to have lower accuracy. So if we think about 2-year-old bulls at a bull sale, because they're at most going to have performance recording for themselves and some pedigree information, but they're certainly not going to have progeny on the ground with performance information, which pushes up their EBV accuracy. So younger bulls, lower accuracy. Older AI sires, for example, quite high accuracy. And so this is where it becomes into an attitude to risk discussion, because if you said to me, well, I'm mating first calf heifers, I want to be pretty confident in my calving ease and birth weight EBVs when I'm using a bull for those first calf heifers and designing those matings, that's where the conversation might be, well, would you be better using a proven AI sire that's got higher accuracy? It's less risky than using a single young bull. The other thing we can do with young bulls is look at a team approach. So while they individually have low accuracy, and if you just selected one and used him as a sire, yes, he could re-rank over time as we get more information on him. If we use 5 or 6, even 3 or 4 young bulls as a bull cohort, while they individually have low accuracy, the accuracy of them as a group is much higher. And so where you can, when you're looking at using younger bulls, I would recommend a team approach to try and minimize risk of them re-ranking, because while they might move individually, in general, the average EBV of that group is going to remain fairly constant over time, even as we get more info. So yeah, it's not so much that I have a threshold, it's more about what situation is it, what are you trying to do, how much certainty do you want, how much risk are you prepared to take, and how can we manage that, and what are the different options.
If I could add there, and I think it's a great question to ask, and I love the way Katrina has answered that in terms of, you know, risk. If we're looking at growth traits, you know, the two weaning yielding final weight type EBVs, they're quite robust traits. So even where the accuracies might be low to moderate, the EBVs might move around a bit, but I tend to think they're quite robust. It's when we get into traits like calving ease, birth weight, scrotal size, carcass traits, where we have two problems. One is that we don't always have a huge volume of data. So that might be the case with carcass traits where we're relying on scan data. The other is, and I hate to say this, birth weight, where we will have multiple, we'll have a range of data quality present. I don't want to discuss the coronet band side of things too much here, but where you have some people using bands and some people using birth weights, there is a good chance that as more data comes in, birth weight EBVs are going to move around because we don't have the same sort of quality of data as we tend to see with your later weight traits, which you're putting through a crush weighing cattle. So I think accuracy is important, particularly for those more difficult traits or the ones that are more sensitive to data quality. The other point I wanted to say is if you look internationally, excuse me, sorry, some countries, not BREEDPLAN, but some countries will report every EBV, EPD, as long as the accuracy is 1% and above. And what it leads to is a culture of just ignore the accuracy. And so people stop thinking about the risk involved. So we tend to limit our EBVs to anything above 20 or 25%. I can't remember what the minimum is. That's to actually just say anything below that is so poorly estimated, we don't think it's worth reporting. So yes, I can understand where something like a minimum accuracy comes in, but thinking about it in terms of risk and knowing that, you know, if there's a trait not reporting, it's just too low, too risky for us to actually report and have available for for selection decisions and bull buying decisions.
So just leading on from that, Brad, as a society, we have quite a lot of, shall I say, lowish accuracy figures. From a society point of view, if we want to improve those accuracy figures, is it a case of getting more people recording, or of the people that are recording, just get them to record more data or more trait data?
Yeah, I would say the latter in this case, Clive. If people aren't recording data, then their animals are unlikely to have much in terms of EBV and accuracy reporting. But for those of you who are already in BREEDPLAN, there is a report that you can access for your herd called Completeness of Performance, which Katrina speaks about widely in her engagements with breeders. It actually shows you what you're doing well and where your gaps are. And it's common to look at a breeder's completeness report and see there'll be some years where they've actually forgotten to submit data. And so go back and do it. So if you're recording birth weights and weaning weights and nothing else, well, you could improve your accuracy by recording later weights or recording the cows when you're recording their progeny for their at weaning. And it can help you identify where the gaps are. Looking at that timeline, I think that timeline slide of Katrina's is brilliant. That's what you look at. You take that, you look at your completeness and go, oh, there's actually some gaps. I think I could actually record those traits. That will add to accuracy, or has the potential to add to accuracy. The other aspect is if you get more breeders entering BREEDPLAN and recording data, well, of course, you end up with a bigger pool. But for those that are looking at their bulls and heifers going, my accuracies don't seem to be so high on some traits, have a look at what sits behind them. If all you're doing is recording birth weight, you're not going to have high accuracy scrotal. You're not going to have high accuracy carcass. That's just the name of the game.
Okay, we're getting into the grind of a future webinar. We did say we'd have a follow-up webinar on how we make the best use of data, and were those for those already in BREEDPLAN. So we're going on to that. We have a specific question from Janet about if you have a 2-year-old bull and it may have a calf on the ground before he is sold at a sale, would this help with his figures? It's quite a specific one.
If you'd used him, say, as a yearling and he had a cohort of calves on the ground and you'd performance recorded those, then yes, that would help with the associated EBV accuracy because we've got some progeny performance on him. If it's a fairly recent calf that hasn't been performance recorded, it's not going to do anything for his EBV accuracy when he's sold as a 2-year-old. So depends whether or not those calves have been performance recorded.
Okay.
And if he is the only sire represented in that group of progeny, those progeny will contribute nothing to him because they're all by him. So if you had 2 sires, one being a yearling bull, those 2 sires with progeny together, then you've got some comparison between the progeny of the 2 sires. That's the little caveat there in the use in whether their progeny data would contribute.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question that I wondered if it would come up because it's something I've mentioned to you before, Brad. So I'll let you take this one first. But would a Breed Society sponsored reference sire add to accuracy nationally?
Potentially. Before you would move into that though, I think it's worth members looking at their own potential for performance recording. If you had a national sire benchmarking program, but in your own herd, you're not really recording performance, all you're doing is getting a bit of information through that sire. But if you're not recording progeny in your own herd, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So it's like a multi-pronged approach. I don't see, I've got to be careful here. I think there's other things to explore first before looking at a sire benchmarking program. They sound like a nice idea, but really it's the commitment to performance recording on the ground it's the critical part.
Well, at least you're consistent because you did say that before, and that's why we've got this
good.
webinar. So.
Well, I would also add genomics can help there, but that's another topic.
Yeah, we perhaps cover that in the next one. There's another question from Graham. Which traits do you find the most inheritable or heritable, and which year's calf crop are birth weights based on? Sorry, we had another question at the time and it all moved.
So our heritability is generally traits of moderate heritability are things like our growth and our carcass traits. Our fertility traits are less heritable. That doesn't mean that you can't make progress in them. It just means that we need more data recorded to try and get to similar accuracy levels. So they're all heritable to a degree. We can certainly make progress. One of the nice things, I'm just thinking of an article we did a while ago, is that even if a trait is lowly heritable, if there's a lot of variation in there, that's something we can use to make progress. So whether or not they're heritable, they need to be heritable, but how heritable they are is only part of the equation. Whether or not we've got variation for that trait is also the other part. So as long as there's variation and a level of heritability, we can certainly make progress. The second part was which year's calf crops are birth weights based on. So the birth weight EBVs will be when we calculate an EBV, it's a combination of pedigree information, performance on that animal, and performance of its relatives, such as its progeny. So I guess all of them would be my answer, because we're certainly using all of the data that's available. Yes, obviously we're going to use that birth weight of that individual calf, but we're also using birth weights that have been recorded in the system for progeny and for pedigree animals to influence that EBV as well. And then correlated traits will also influence the EBV as well. So all of the information is working together to calculate an EBV.
If I could just add on the heritable, I would put my neck out and say that all traits associated with beef production are heritable. Our ability to determine that level of heritability always depends on data volume and data quality. So at the moment, none of you, I guess, are measuring methane production from your grazing cattle, but your population will have genetic variation in terms of methane production. It's just that we're not measuring it, and we don't have good techniques to be able to measure it. So all traits are heritable, but what we have to do is model the heritability that is being expressed in the population. And to do that, we need good quality data and a volume of it.
Okay, thank you. Another question about EBVs in terms of if calves are sold before the chance for weight recording, i.e. store cattle, 10 to 12 months, how does that affect the EBV of the dam and sire?
So I would start, it's not a sire and dam answer, but if they're 10 to 12 months old, they're old enough to take at least a 200-day wait before they go. So my first answer would be, it's absolutely fine to sell culls to store cattle at 10 to 12 months. We see that similar situation in Australia, but I think I said it on one of my slides, where you can, before those store cattle go off, take a weight on them so that we've at least got a 200-day wait. That can be done from 80 days of age. So they should have the opportunity to take at least a 200, if not an early 400 if they're closer to 12 months. In terms of how that affects the EBV of the dam and the sire, if we can get a weight on them, that's useful to go back against the parents. Obviously, with culling, we're in a situation where not every animal's still going to be there for a 600-day wait. That's not unexpected. If we don't have information, we obviously can't use that information to calculate the EBV of the sire and the dam, but we can use what we have. So we certainly know that there are situations where people won't be able to take 600-day waits because they've sold their steers. What I would also add there is, if you're not fully terminal and you're a self-replacing herd and you're keeping the females, even if you've sold those steers, you can take 600-day waits on their sisters. That's helpful because that's another source of information that can go back on related animals, back to sire and dam.
So basically, the more information you get on a particular sire or dam, the better. And if it's across different herds, again, even better, because you've got broader comparisons.
Yeah.
And if I could add into there, the importance of at least getting one record on the whole contemporary group. So 200-day wait is really the key one there. If you say, well, this group of my bulls, I don't really want to keep them, so I'm just going to steer them and sell them because they're at the runty end of the group. If you don't record them and you only record the animals that you're planning to keep and grow on further, you've actually removed some of the genetics that these other ones are meant to be compared against. You've actually removed some of the potentially poorer genetics. So it's always best to record the whole group at one point, 200-day, and then do your steering, then sell them off as store cattle, whatever it is. But you have one point in time where the whole group is compared and you've got the full expression of genetic diversity in the calf crop being represented. That is critical. It's not just of the animals you want to keep that you measure, it's everything that represents genetic diversity within your calf crop.
And that's a really good point about selective performance recording versus whole herd recording. Those poorer performing animals are just as important as the good animals. The good animals don't look good if the poorer animals aren't there to be compared to.
Okay, thank you. Just another one. So how are we progressing with introducing the classification figures into the ABRE program? Is it looking positive? Now, I know this is something you sent through to me probably early part of December, Brad, because I was talking to someone else about it yesterday. So I'll leave it.
Yes.
Add you to that.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the question, Tina. It's a good one. Beef Shorthorn is not the only beef society looking to introduce this system. It's actually something to be introduced nationally throughout the UK. So I'm currently just trying to keep all the cats herded. They keep scattering. I just am trying to coordinate everything so that we can launch it to all at the same time. All of the beef structural traits, classification traits, they've all been set up in the database so the data can be recorded. I'm about to send out a template that will allow the classifiers to record that data, submit it to the Breed Society, and then I have to explain to the Breed Society what these files will be and how to use it. So it's underway. The delay has just been, it's not just a beef shorthorn situation I'm addressing, it's national.
Thank you. What you didn't say is we're at the front of that queue. So,
oh, totally. Actually, it was beef shorthorn that initiated this, and I think it's a great approach. We want our clients to take ownership for things, and we think, you know, how we record structural traits in Australia is different to what you're doing in the UK. That's what we want to see. We want to see you taking ownership for how you want things, and then it's up to someone like me to work out how we put that into systems that work for you as breeders.
Yeah, so it's been a positive response to that, which is good, and I think it will be a positive going forward. We don't seem to have any more questions in the chat. I don't know if anybody wants to raise a hand and ask a question in person, or we've heard. Well, go on, Brad.
It wasn't a question. I just wanted to say, if people do have questions of any sort, please send them to Clive and Ellie to come to me, because it's important for me that they are in the loop of discussion. Sometimes breeders come direct to me, but I think it's more helpful if it comes through one channel, because then we can find ways of, oh, that's actually a number of people have asked that, and we can write an article that then goes out to membership. So I much rather do it that way.
Okay, thank you. Valid point. That appears to be the case of we've exhausted the questions for tonight. As I said at the start, this webinar was aimed at those who were interested in getting started with BREEDPLAN or had just started and wanted to know how to get going with it, really. And we were looking to do a follow-up webinar on making best use of BREEDPLAN and sort of those extra steps forward to get the value. So we will still look at that, but I think we've started to cover some of those areas already tonight, which has been very good. Thank you very much. If there's no more questions, I would just say the same as Brad, in that if you think of anything else, feel free to send it through to us and we'll forward it on for answering. Very big thank you for Katrina for doing the presentation and getting up extra early to make sure she was in the office by 6:30 in the morning, so she'd got a proper internet to do the presentation. So thank you very much for that. And obviously, Brad, thank you very much for your input previously and for your support tonight. So if there's no further questions, thank you all for attending. Hope you found it useful. I know I have. It will be lodged on the website, so if you need to revisit anything, you should be able to do that in the next week or so. And I wish you all a very good evening, and Katrina and Brad, have a good working day.